I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old Oscar Countdown. And once again, we are looking at another category for the 2023 Oscars, predicting what's going to get nominated while following along with the awards season in general. But if you're new to the series, that's what I do every single week. I pick a different category, I predict what's going to get nominated for the 2023 Oscars. Then when it does get nominated, I predict what's going to win. And along the way, we're going to be talking about Golden Globes and Critics' Choice and reactions to DGA and PGA and SAG and all that fun stuff. So do subscribe to the channel, like the video. That sort of stuff helps for small channels like ourselves so we can build a really great community and grow this channel. So we just finished with the acting categories. Now we're going to jump into the directing category, which is always a fun one in recent years because we've had these international directors come in last minute, have some surprises. We've even had, a couple of Best Picture winners now not be nominated for Best Director, which would have been unheard of back in the day. But now recently with Green Book and Coda, we're starting to see a little bit of a separation between picture and director. So it's become more of an interesting category over the years. However, I do think there is a clear winner for this year, and that's going to be my first pick, Steven Spielberg for The Fabelmans. Of course, Steven Spielberg, legendary director, two-time winner of this category. This definitely feels like his most personal film and a film that is the perfect end cap to his career. Now, he's not dead yet, of course, but he is 75. He is nearing a death, and he's sort of reflecting back on his time as a director. And in the same way, I think of a lot of people gave Clint Eastwood the award for Unforgiven sort of later on in his career, sort of a reflection back, in the same way that they gave Alfonso Cuarón a director a win for Roma and his sort of looking back. Spielberg does something similar here, making essentially an autobiographical film about his childhood and his parents' relationship. So you got a director who is wildly celebrated with a movie that's currently the Best Picture frontrunner, lots of emotion, lots of heart, very crowd-pleasing. So that's positive. Of course, it always helps if you're a contender in Best Director and Best Picture, even though there's been a split in recent years. We've still seen, Chloe Zhao win for Nomadland in Director, and then also that movie wins for Best Picture. Same thing with Guillermo del Toro and The Shape of Water. And why I'm so confident Spielberg is going to get in for the win at the very least, even if The Fabelmans doesn't end up winning Best Picture, is because the directing category for the most part is pretty solid throughout the entire year. I mean, last year was Jane Campion early on. We figured that out. She won. Similarly with Chloe Zhao, or even someone like Damien Chazelle or Alfonso Cuarón. I mean, when we think of upsets like a Green Book, or we think of upsets like Moonlight, the directors of the presumed frontrunners still end up winning. Roma was supposed to win, got surprised by Green Book, but Alfonso still won. Similarly with Damien Chazelle still winning for director. So the director category in particular still stays sort of preordained very early on in the season, and right now it seems like it's Spielberg's award to lose. He is like a past winner, legendary director, making a very personal movie, which I think, when you think about the Best Director, could anybody else have made The Fabelmans? No, this is very much a movie that Steven Spielberg could have been the only person to make it. I think the directing branch will appreciate that. He also does seem like one of those legendary directors like William Wyler or John Ford or Billy Wilder, who has had so many successful Oscars and directing Oscars. He does seem to be like in that kind of a category, so a third Oscar doesn't necessarily seem crazy to think about when we're talking about Steven Spielberg. And the times when we have seen surprises in this category, like a Bong Joon-ho for Parasite, that wasn't necessarily a solidified race. If you remember, Sam Mendes had 1917 premiere in end of December, sort of early January. That's when that movie started to gain a lot of momentum, where we're like, okay, Sam, he's going to win another one, and then they happened to be surprised, Bong Joon-ho. But when we've had these sort of early on crownings, like Jane Campion last year, or Chloe Zhao, or even a Damien Chazelle for that matter, they've usually stayed true, and just the fact that Spielberg has been campaigning for this movie, premiere this film at festivals, it's such a personal movie to him. I do see that sort of connection, and I'd be surprised if he didn't win, frankly. So he's in my first slot there. Then this is where it starts to get a little more interesting. In the second slot, I'm going to go with the Daniels from Everything Everywhere All at Once. Now, I know some people have some cautions towards this getting nominated, and I could see a world in which this does sort of get snubbed, just because the Academy doesn't really like to nominate duo directors, particularly directors who are new to the game. They're not someone like the Coen brothers, for example, so they are sort of newer to the game, sort of unknown. The Academy is all about, frankly, auteurship and a singular voice. I mean, you see that even in the screenplay categories. They don't like multiple screenwriters. They like one screenwriter. They like one director. They're pretty traditional in that sense. But I still have it here at number 2. Why? Well, first of all, Everything Everywhere All at Once is a very well-liked movie. I have it number 2 in my Best Picture rankings as of right now. I think it even has a chance to win. So I think it will be a well-nominated movie in the acting, in screenplay. I think it's going to win for Best Original Screenplay. So usually when we're talking about movies that are well-liked, movies that are in the sort of top 5 of the Best Picture rankings, most of the time those directors get nominated. Not all the time. You know, we've seen upsets like Green Book winning Best Picture without getting a director nomination. Last year, Coda wins without Sean Hayter getting in for director. And that's understandable, at least to me, because you look at those movies and you go, they're kind of anonymously directed in the sense that the camera's very still, there's not very noticeable camera work, it's not very showy. You don't really... It's a movie that focuses on the screenplay and the performances more than, say, the camera work or the visuals. And that's okay. Those are 2 great movies, and there's nothing wrong with that. But usually when we're talking about Best Director, those movies don't get appreciated as much because it's harder to look into what the director is doing. It's more of an invisible approach to directing in terms of ultimately trying to emphasize that story, but not sort of bringing too much attention to the camera and that sort of thing, and themes and whatnot. But the directing category, for the most part, likes the Sam Mendes from 1917 with a distinct style and is doing this really complex thing, and the production was crazy, and how do they do it? They like those sort of stories and added elements. Which is actually why I think Everything Everywhere All at Once will actually get nominated. If you look at this movie, it's not a screenplay-based, story-driven kind of a movie. It's incredibly visually inventive and creative and weird and different, and there's lots of different camera moves and flashing back and forth, and there's a clear, distinct style, and just how the story is structured in general, condensing all these complex topics into relatively easy to understand emotions and storytelling linearity. This is actually a very visual movie, so it's unlike those other movies of Best Picture winners that didn't get in for a director. I do think that this is a more noticeable directing effort, so I think that will really help it. Add on to the fact that, of course, it's a well-liked movie. Then when we think of movies in the Everything Everywhere All at Once category, movies like Get Out or Minari. These are movies that were released early in the year that gained some buzz and some steam, and then both of their directors got nominated. It's still possible for a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which premiered in April, May, to still get a directing nomination, to still get that buzz, particularly if it's a sort of a strong directorial vision in the same way that I think Everything Everywhere All at Once is. I don't think anyone else, aside from the Daniels, could have even thought of a movie like this. And I think that sort of directorial vision will be appreciated. Then in my 3rd slot, I'm going to go with Damien Chazelle from Babylon. The clearest example of the next great American director, already won at the ripe age of 31 for La La Land. He is sort of seen as, I think, the next one of these Hollywood directors like a William Wilder or even Steven Spielberg to sort of take on that mantle, and every movie that he does will have some sort of Oscar consideration. La La Land, of course, did incredibly well with 6 wins and 14 nominations, and same thing with Whiplash as well. And his last film, First Man, didn't do as well. That being said, he still got some strong technical nominations there. And here with Babylon, press screening is today, so by the release of this video, we'll know whether or not this is a big Oscar contender or not. I think it will be, just based on how Paramount delayed this film an entire year from December of last year to December of this year, and of course the sort of people behind it and Damien's sort of pretty great track record in his past 3 films. And especially based on the trailer, which is what I have to go off of right now, it does seem like a sort of masculine camera movement complex kind of a production. We've already heard quotes of Damien saying this is his most complex movie yet, with a lot of different locations, a lot of sort of large productions. I think there's going to be a lot of appreciation on the technical side, something that not all of the directing nominees have, but there's always one. Let's not forget Christopher Nolan will get nominated for Dunkirk, even though it doesn't have any performances nominated, but because it has all this technical appreciation. I think Babylon will have that technical appreciation and some acting love. I think Margot Robbie will get in for Best Lead Actress, for example. But those are sort of the benefits for it. I think it's going to be a large production, complex production. There's going to be a clear style and visual style that Chazelle brings to a lot of his movies. This seems to be more of a rousing kind of a movie than something like First Man, which is a little bit more reserved and didn't get as much attention. So I do think this is going to be a big movie with sort of large, impressive production. Damien Chazelle, past winner, and seen, I think, as the sort of next young kid to sort of take over the Hollywood mantle. So I do expect it to get nominated and for Babylon to be a very successful film. Then my 4th slot, I'm going to go with Todd Field from Tár. And For me, when I was thinking about if he was going to get nominated or not, I thought intimately of Paul Thomas Anderson in many ways, because Paul Thomas Anderson, his first couple movies, he gets nominated for screenplay, then eventually does There Will Be Blood, gets nominated for screenplay and director. And those first sort of movies, he was seen as a writer for the most part. Great movies, but more of a writer. And then There Will Be Blood comes out, and he goes, wow, no, this is a writer and a visual storyteller. I mean, There Will Be Blood has very little dialogue, but is so impressive on a visual landscape. So because he developed his sort of visual style, I think the Academy finally recognized him for director for There Will Be Blood. I think Todd Field will have a similar sort of trajectory. His last two films were nominated for writing, In the Bedroom and Little Children. Now you see Tár, 16 years later after his last movie, and there's a strong visual style to it. He does look like he's elevated his game and upgraded, and just his control of the craft and of the medium. There's an incredible amount of patience and control that he puts on this film, and you can tell that when you're watching the film, you're in the hands of a master, you're in the hands of someone who is confidently telling you this story, and the patience that he has, particularly with this film, I think is noticeable, at least from a directing standpoint. When we're seeing a shot linger, or when we're seeing the pace of certain things, or the spiralation of an intrigue of this sort of character study of Lydia Tár, this composer, you can understand that there is a strong vision behind the film, and I think Todd Field will be appreciated for that. Now, he's never been nominated for director before, even though his film has been nominated for Best Picture before, so there's a little bit of concerns there. I don't think Tár is going to be a strong Best Picture contender. I don't think it's going to win, but I do think that because of the visual distinctiveness of the film, plus its sort of great performance, and the fact that Todd has been trying to make a movie for so long and has finally done it, there is sort of a legendary, mythic kind of a status to him, and it does feel like a movie that is purposeful, that took its time, that every scene and every frame was crafted, and there's a clear vision. I do think the director's branch will appreciate that ultimately. Then with my final slot, I'm going to go with Sarah Polley from Women Talking, and this is a bit of a mixed bag for me. Ultimately, I put it in because I believe in Women Talking. I think this is going to be a strong Best Picture contender. I think it's going to win for Best Adapted Screenplay, could even win in Best Supporting Actress. I think it's going to get 6, 7 nominations. And matter of fact, if you get 6 or 7 nominations, most of the time you get nominated for Best Director, especially when your movie is, competitive in a lot of these categories, like supporting actress, like in screenplay. Now, it does happen. I mean, look at Denis Villeneuve for Dune from just last year, to give you an example. But usually, particularly above the line kind of movies, so I'm talking about acting movies, screenplay movies, not necessarily movies that get a lot of technical nominations. Most of the time, these above the line kind of movies do very well when it comes to Best Director. And then added on top of the fact that Sarah Polley is a past nominee. She's been nominated for writing before, so she has a familiarity within the Academy. And for a lot of voters, they've been trying to really have a diverse lineup of directors. If you look at the past 2 years, both of the directing winners were women, so I do think there is a sort of group of the Academy that is trying to make their lineup more diverse. So that the fact that she's a woman, and this is sort of such a female-centric story that we don't get all the time, I think people will give her extra points for getting this kind of a movie made and then ultimately executed on screen. I do think there's going to be some consideration on that part, so if that's the ultimate factor, it will push her over the edge. That being said, the reason why she's in my 5th slot, even though I think a movie like Women Talking will get more nominations than a movie like Tár, is just because, for the most part, this is a acting screenplay movie, like a Green Book or a Coda. I mean, the directing is really noticeable in the color grading of the film. It's very muted, it's very gray, brownish. At times it's even hard to see what's going on. But that being said, it's still, people in a room talking. There's not necessarily really dynamic camera work all the time. It's pretty static. So, and the performances and the writing are the emphasis of the film. So will people appreciate that? Will it be sort of obvious enough as a directing achievement for her to get nominated? Maybe not. And then some people may not like the directorial choices of, for example, that color grading. Plus, you have to consider something like screeners. A lot of people watch these movies not in a theater, but at home. And if they have their TV settings wrong, it could be completely unviewable. And that ultimately may sort of make people actually not like the directing of the film, even if they may like the movie itself. So that's something we have to keep an eye on. But ultimately, I chose it because I still think Women Talking will be a strong contender at the Oscars. Then some possible contenders. My first one is going to be Park Chan-Wook from Decision to Leave. And this is a classic international upset surprise. Like, if I were to pick one that's going to be a surprise 100-to-1 odds come Oscar night, it's going to be Park Chan-Wook from Decision to Leave. Now, it's not necessarily, it should be 100-to-1 odds anyways, because when you look at the past few years, whether it be Ryusuke Hamaguchi for Drive My Car, or Thomas Vinterberg for Another Round, or Pavel Pawlikowski for Cold War, we're seeing these international directors whose movies are not nominated for Best Picture and nominated for very few Oscars. We're seeing them get nominated for Best Director, sort of out of surprise, out of the blue. Not get nominated for DGA, but for some reason the Academy has a strong international base, particularly within the directors branch of the Academy, the people who will ultimately nominate these films. And we're seeing a lot of international support. Now, you can go all the way back to the 60s with Fellini getting nominated and directors like that, even though their film won't get nominated for Best Picture. So there is always an international appreciation. Right now, I'm not predicting that just because I'm still in a wait-and-see mode, and I think the top 5 are a little bit more likely than a surprise, director nomination. But when trying to pick one, you could have picked someone like a Ruben Östlund for Triangle of Sadness. You could even pick Alejandro Iñárritu for Bardo. But for me, Park Chan-wook made the most sense. Why? It sort of captures all the bases of the world in its internationalness. So I think it's going to get nominated for Best International Feature. It's the South Korean entry. It could even win at this stage, especially if Park Chan-wook gets nominated for Best Director. Then you have Mubi, who's the distributor and campaign, particularly in North America and the States. They're doing a lot of campaign. They're really promoting this film. This is their sort of first movie that they own. That's a big, serious movie that they're going to really push and try to get out some awards from. That's what I believe. That's what I've been hearing in terms of the U.S. side. So there's going to be campaigning there. Then you think of Park Chan-wook as a director. Well, he has American connections as well because he's done English language films in Stoker. He also did English language miniseries in Little Drummer Girl. He's won in the past. So that's just on the American side. Then, of course, in Asia, because the movie's set in Korea and he's a Korean director, he has support and fans there. And then when you think of Europe, well, he's also appreciated there. I mean, Old Boy premiered at Cannes and won the Grand Prix. This film, Decision to Leave, premiered at Cannes. Another one of his films, The Handmaiden, premiered at Cannes as well. So he's had a long history at Cannes there. He's won a BAFTA before for Old Boy, so he has European support. Movie's doing, I think, a good job campaigning in the States, and of course he has fans because he's done English language films. And then he also has support from Korea. So when we're looking at all the sort of different amalgamations, that's a big thing. He has support from everywhere. And then the most important thing for me was when we're looking at these Best Director predictions and these sort of surprise international directors, we always think it's like kind of, oh, out of nowhere, what a surprise. This is crazy that happened. But if you look at all of them, if you look at Ryusuke Hamaguchi, his film got nominated for Best Picture. If you look at Thomas Vinterberg and Pavel Pawlikowski, their films got nominated for Best Cinematography and Best Foreign Language Film in the case of Cold War, or just Best International Film in the case of Another Round. Therefore, when we're talking about a movie that gets nominated for Best Director, well, it almost always has to get at least one other nomination. So when I'm looking at a guy like Ruben Östlund, well, that's not going to get nominated for Best International Feature. That's in the English language. It could get in for Screenplay. I don't think it is. Is he just going to get in for Best Director? That's unlikely. At least with Park Chan-wook, you can say he got support from all the sort of international groups, and his film is likely to get nominated and maybe even win for Best International Feature. So therefore, there's a direct connection to have a sort of Thomas Vinterberg Another Round-esque kind of a connection, where there's a strong, international film gets also nominated for Best Director too, so there's a little bit of a connection. So that's a surprise potential that could come Oscar night, but I think it's the smarter one versus someone like just randomly guessing Alejandro Iñárritu, or even someone like a Maria Schrader, if you consider that. Then my final selection here is going to be Martin McDonagh from the Banshees of Inisherin, and his nomination, I think, is solely based on the strength of the Banshees of Inisherin. I think this will be a very strong film, but I think this is going to be a film that does very well in screenplay and does very well in acting categories. Similarly to a Green Book or a Coda or, I don't know, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, Martin McDonagh's last film, and that film was essentially, in my opinion, number 2 in terms of winning Best Picture. He very could have won Best Picture, but Martin McDonagh didn't get nominated for Best Director for a movie that was so strong. The Banshees of Inisherin is equally as strong. I think it's a number 2, number 3 kind of a Best Picture contender. But why am I going to predict director to happen this time when it didn't happen for 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri? Even though I do think both films are sort of visually interesting, and so is this one, I don't think it's going to get nominated for Best Cinematography. I'm not even sure if it's going to get nominated for Best Score, so I don't think it's going to be a technical movie. I think it's going to be mostly above-the-line stuff. And I do think ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a film that is known in its strengths, and its focus ultimately is on the writing, is on the performances, not the visual style. So while it is sort of returning back to Ireland, he does have more control of the craft. He has grown as a director, particularly for something like In Bruges, particularly his visual style. I still think he sort of goes on the outside because I don't think his directing is essentially flashy enough to get in. but there could be sort of a redemption because he didn't get in for 3 billboards, and he is a contender for sure. But right now, just because his film isn't as directorially flashy, we'll say, with the camera movements and the cinematography and the visual aspect, I think the director's branch just won't appreciate it as much as some of my other nominees. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on what you think is going to get nominated for Best Director. What is your 100-to-1 odds international director that you think could get nominated? I'd love to hear that stuff in the comments down below. Stay tuned to next week. We're going to be talking about the Best Adapted and Original Screenplay predictions for the 2 and 1 as we get closer now into the Oscar race. We're going to start to buddy up a couple of these categories. So do stay tuned for that. Longer videos, more content for you. That's why I do this. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.